With over 16 weapon classes and each weapon class containing 7 weapons on average, Albion has a truly massive combat system with over 272 weapons. Now, this makes for a really in-depth and interactive combat system, but this also makes it very hard to approach or comprehend to the newer players. So, in this video, I'm going to give you guys a complete overview of each and every weapon, and I will be telling you what that specific weapon is used for. Let's start off the video with my favorite weapon line, the quarterstaffs. The quarterstaffs work by placing damage over time effects on your enemies and kiting them. Now the first quarterstaff we have on the list is the normal quarterstaff, which puts a death curse on your enemy, and the death curse damage is scaled based on how many wild curse charges your enemy has. It does massive damage to a single target, potentially enough to one-shot them. Really strong in solo PvP and 2v2 PvP. Next up we have the great quarterstaff. This is used in small scale and large scale PvP fights. This places a circle on the ground which repeatedly applies the wild curse to your targets. It also purges them of healing over time effects like the nature staff's Q spell. Next up we have the staff of damnation, which does a massive AoE and also shreds armor of anyone who is hit by it. Very good for ZVZ fights where you can armor shred a million people at once. Next up we have the great quarterstaff, which does a fear debuff on your enemy based on how many wild curse charges they are under. So when you hit the enemy with this ghost, they will be feared and they will run away from you, and the ghost will consume 2 wild cursed charges. So it's very good for solo PvP and small scale PvP such as 2v2s. Next up we have the cursed skull. This is a zoning spell that does true damage to your targets and also persists for a long time, so you can deny access to a corridor for your enemies when you are using the spell. Very good for solo, small scale and large scale PvP. Also not bad in PvE. Next up we have the life quarterstaff. It can channel a massive AoE that purges every buff on your enemy. Very good for small scale, large scale and solo PvP. Last but not the least, on the quarterstaffs we have the shadow collar, one of the best weapons in the entire game for PvE content. It has 3 variations on the E-spell, the first one being the leather armor variant, which does 100% lifesteal on all of your enemies you hit with the E-spell. The cloth armor variant of this E-spell does massive damage. It's comparable to a stalker jacket and it can absolutely melt people. And finally we have the plate variant of the shadow collar E-spell, which summons an inner shadow that bonks them with a hammer. This also reduces their armor, so you can melt them with your Q spells and W spell when you use that. It also slows them down massively, so it's all around a very strong weapon. Good for soloing raid level PvE and also sometimes used in solo PvP. The Shapeshifter is one of the most unique and well-rounded weapon classes in the entire game, which can do pretty much anything in the game. So the first one we have is the Blood Moon Staff. The Blood Moon Staff has a passive of 7% lifesteal when you are in the werewolf transformation, which can be very strong in solo PvP, small scale PvP and soloing raid level PvE targets. Next up we have the light collar. The light collar is also very strong in PvP. It's not that great in solo PvE, but in group PvE this is absolutely amazing. The light collar's E spell turns you into a phoenix that does massive damage with its Q spells, and the W spell just summons a orbital nuke. It does massive damage in a AoE, making it really strong in basically every content there is. Really strong in small scale, large scale PvP, strong in raid level PvE. Next up we have the Hellspawn Staff or the Imp Staff. So this weapon can transform you into a small demon bat, and this demon bat has absolutely insane damage. So the Q spell allows you to teleport to a targeted location dealing damage, and the W is a rush of fireballs that does massive damage to your target. And also when you die while you're in the imp form, you will not actually die, but you will resurrect yourself based on how much shift charges you have. You will have some health while you resurrect. Very strong in a small scale PvP such as corrupteds and hellgates. Also good in mists apparently. Next up we have the prowling staff, one of the most popular ones in the shapeshifter weapons because it's very strong in the mist. It is used in solo and small scale PvP to assassinate a single target. It can turn you invisible when no one is in this white circle. You will be invisible to your enemies. Now the W spell allows you to pounce on your enemies, and the Q spell can be cast 3 times, while the third cast does massive damage which is used to execute your opponents. Next up we have the root-bound staff. The root-bound staff is also very strong in small scale and large scale PvE due to its strong support nature. The Q spell allows you to place small circles on the ground which heal your allies and give them a healing received bonus. The W spell makes you immune to all damage and crowd control effects, also gives your allies a small shield which makes them a lot more tankier. Next up we have the Earthrune staff, which is very strong in large scale fights due to its massive crowd control and tank capabilities. The Q spell is a ranged stun. The W is a zoning spell that can zone out your players. Very strong in ZVZs and small scale PvP. Next up we have the primal staff, which is very good for small scale PvP, not very great for large scale, but for small scale it shines really well. Also good in PvE content. First weapon in the dagger tree line is the one hand dagger, very strong for solo PvE and solo PvP and soloing raid or group dungeon mobs without any healers or support. Next up we have the claws, which are really good for ganking because they get to pin down a target and deal massive damage, and while this is happening your party mates can also do massive amounts of damage to a target, making it an ideal weapon for ganking tanky mobs such as bears and mammoths. Next up we have the dagger pair. The dagger pair is one of the best assassinating weapons in the game. When you use the E-spell on max charges, it does massive amounts of damage to a single target and puts a damage over time debuff on your enemy, which allows you to quickly assassinate your target when they are at low health or sometimes when they are at full health. Next up we have the death givers, which are really strong for solo PvP and small scale PvP because they have a E-spell that can be used 2 times when they have 3 assassin spirit charges. And when you use the E-spell, you temporarily become invisible for a small moment, making it really easy to kite your opponents. Next up we have the bridled fury, which is a really strong weapon in ZVZs and medium scale PvP. When you use the E-spell and max stacks, does massive damage in a AoE in front of you and knocks you back. So after you do your damage, you get to withdraw. Very strong in Zerg vs Zerg fights. Next up we have the Demon Fang. It's used in small scale and large scale PvP battles for its multiple hitting AoE attack. It also does a decent bit of damage. It's very good. Last but not the least, we have the strongest dagger in the entire game, which is used in all types of PvP content. Now the Bloodletters E-spell comes out terrifyingly fast and dashes through multiple enemies, and each enemy hit by the Bloodletter dash takes some damage, and if the enemy happens to be below 40% of their health, it will do a bunch of bonus damage, probably executing the target. If you hit a target below 40% health, you will receive a massive cooldown reduction on your E-spell, making it ready to kill another person. The fire staffs are a heavy DPS class with long range. The first fire staff we have is the normal fire staff. The E-spell can be cast quickly by cancelling the cast time sooner, but if you do the full channel, you will do massive AoE damage around the target that you are hitting. It is very good for solo PvP and is also useful in small scale PvP. It's also good for PvE. Next up we have the Great Fire Staff. The Great Fire Staff shoots out a fire pillar at the targeted location, dealing moderate damage. This is good for solo PvP, solo PvE and small scale PvP. Next up we have the Infernal Staff. The Infernal Staff will light your target on fire and give them a fire trail when they walk around, so any other enemy touching that fire trail will have a fear debuff placed on them. This is very strong in solo PvP and is also viable in small scale PvP. Next up we have the Blazing Staff. This is used to summon a fire tornado at your targeted location, dealing massive damage and placing a massive damage over time debuff on your enemies. This is good in raid level PvE, small scale PvP and large scale PvP. Next up we have the Wildfire Staff. The Wildfire Staff shoots out a magma sphere in front of the player, dealing massive damage to any enemy that touches it, and it also deals 12% of an enemy's health bar as true damage. So even on low tiers you can contend with high tier players. Very good in small scale PvP and solo PvP. Next up we have the Dawn Song. The Dawn Song summons a massive phoenix that sets the ground on fire, and every enemy in this fire field will have their healing received reduced by 40%. So this weapon is good in every type of PvP. Whether it be solo PvP, small scale PvP or large scale, it's very strong. Finally, on the fire staffs we have the Brimstone Staff, which is used to call down a literal meteor on your enemies. This is good for small scale and large scale PvP battles. The Frost Staffs are ranged DPS / support weapons. The first Frost Staff we have is the normal Frost Staff. It shoots out freezing wind in a cone in front of you, and everyone hit by it will be rooted in place and will take some damage. So this is very good for kiting your opponents in a solo and small scale PvP. Next up we have the Great Frost Staff. The Great Frost Staff can call down Ice Shower 2 times, and both of these ice showers will do massive damage to your target, and it has a very short cooldown, so it's also a very good kiting option for solo and small scale PvP. Next up we have the Glacial Staff. The Glacial Staff summons a ice storm that will move in the directed location while slowing and damaging the players within it. It is used for crowd control in massive fights. Next up we have the Arctic Staff. The Arctic Staff has a spell that lets you shoot out ice spears in front of you, and while you channel these ice spheres you can also move, making it a really great DPS option for solo PvP and small scale PvP. Next up we have the Permafrost Prism. The Permafrost Prism places a massive ice bomb on your targeted location, which explodes after 2 seconds, dealing massive damage to everyone in its AoE radius. Very good for large scale PvP fights and also small scale PvP fights. Next up we have the Horrorfrost Staff, which will conjure a snowball that will knock your enemies up into the air and slow them down. This is used in small scale PvP. Next up we have the Chill Howl. The Chill Howl can be cast on yourself, on your allies or on your enemies. The target will become immune to damage for a few seconds and will take massive damage if their enemy when the ice explodes. This is used in small scale and solo PvP. The War Gloves are melee brawlers with heavy damage and crowd control. The first gloves we have is the Spiked Gauntlets. The Spiked Gauntlets deal massive damage in a cone in front of them. They deal the highest damage to players in plate armor. They deal medium damage to players in leather and deal low damage to players in cloth armor, which makes them really strong for dealing massive damage to enemy tanks, which are usually, well, tanky. Next up we have the Brawler Gloves. The Brawler Gloves do a massive damage AoE in front of you and reset the cooldown on your Q spell, so you can use it twice. So the combo would be Q, E and Q. Very good in small scale and solo PvP. Next up we have the Spiked Gauntlets. The Spiked Gauntlets let you jump to a targeted location, dealing damage on impact. If the target is close to you, you deal more damage. The further they are away, the less damage you do. This is used in solo and small scale PvP. Next up we have the Raven Strike gloves. The Raven Strike charges up the E-spell and the damage is dependent on how much you charge it up. So a fully charged E-spell deals massive damage in a massive AoE and also knocks all of your enemies in the air, interrupting their spell casting. Very good in large scale and small scale PvP. Next up we have the Ursine Maulers, which do a massive cone in front of you that can be moved. So after you hit your enemies with the E-spell, they explode after a few seconds and deal some more damage. Very good in small scale and large scale PvP battles. Next up we have the Hellfire Hands, which conjure a magma ball that bounces around in front of the target moving forward, and every target hit by the magma ball takes massive damage, used in 1v1 PvP and small scale PvP. And finally in the War Gloves category we have the Fists of Avalon. So the Fists of Avalon make you jump into the targeted position, enabling a second cast of the E-spell. The first cast does some damage and the second cast does some more damage, and before the second cast's damage comes out, they will purge any buff on your enemy, making them really good for small scale and solo PvP. Axes work based on their Q charges, which is a debuff that applies the bleed buildup on all of your enemies. Now this bleed stacks debuff your enemies so that they receive less healing when they have maximum stacks. The E-spells on Axes will also do damage based on the amount of bleed stacks an enemy has. Now the battle axe can throw its E-spell 2 times. The first throw will do damage based on how many bleed stacks the enemy has, and the second throw will also do damage based on how many bleed stacks they have, but it also heals you for a small amount. These features make it really good for solo PvP and solo PvE. This weapon can do solo PvP in corrupted dungeons mists and can also do solo group dungeons in the yellow zones. Next up we have the Great Axe. The Great Axe is very simple. All you have to do is press your E-spell, you spin around, do a bunch of damage in your AoE. This weapon is very strong because of its simplicity, and the spinning animation is not interruptible, so you can't be interrupted when you are doing that. It's great for small scale PvP, solo content such as solo dungeons, open world farming, and that's about it. Very simple, very strong. Now we have one of the most recognizable weapons in the entire game, that is the Bear Paws. If you have ever ganked in Albion, or if you have ever been ganked in Albion, you will for sure know this weapon. So the spell of this weapon is it allows you to leap forward, dealing damage in a AoE in front of you. This AoE also applies a true damage debuff on the target, which means they will take a fixed amount of damage regardless of their resistance or armor tier. Very good for ganking and small scale PvP. Next up we have the Halberd. Halberd is a support weapon for small scale PvP fights, which has a AoE that debuffs your enemies with heal reduction, making it really strong to apply pressure on enemies and prevent them from getting healed up by their healers. After the Halberd we have the Carrion Collar, which is very similar to the Halberd, but it's a ranged option. This weapon throws a raven, and every enemy that is hit by the raven will receive some damage, a bleed, and also a debuff that reduces their healing. Very good for small scale PvP, just like the Halberd. Next up we have a Realm Breaker, also one of the more iconic weapons of this game. This weapon allows you to jump forward, dealing massive damage in a AoE in front of you, which shrinks the enemy and their health pool, so they take more damage from the spells cast by you or your ally in the next few seconds. Very good for small scale PvP, PvE, and basically everything small scale. It's really good. Next up we have one of the coolest looking weapons in the game, the Infernal Scythe. The E-spell on Infernal Scythe is also a little bit unique in the axe tree. So the E-spell allows you to swing your axe twice, and when the second hit of the axe hits, if your enemy is below 40% health, they will take a lot of bonus damage and probably be executed. It's very good in small scale PvP and solo PvP. In solo it can be a little tough, but small scale it's great. Now we have the Crystal Reaper, which is a new weapon in the Crystal tree line. The spell of the Crystal Reaper conjures a blue field in front of you, and it allows you to use the E-spell multiple times. The E-spell is very simple, it's just some damage in a small AoE in front of you. And as long as you hit an enemy, the cooldown is massively reduced. This is good for small scale PvP and sometimes solo PvP. The hammers are a melee brawling tank type weapon, and the first hammer we have is the Symbol Hammer, which does a AoE stun around the player character, dealing moderate damage. This is used in small scale PvP and small scale PvE. Next up we have a Pole Hammer. The Pole Hammer special skill shoots out some massive line which will stun and interrupt everyone in that line. This is good for small scale PvP and solo PvP. Next up we have the Great Hammer. The Great Hammer spell knocks back all of the enemies you pass through and stuns them, dealing moderate damage. It's used in small scale and solo PvP. Next up we have Hand of Justice. The Hand of Justice pulls targets and smashes them in one spot, stunning them and crowd controlling together to a single spot. Very good in small scale PvP and PvE. Next up we have the Tomb Hammer. The Tomb Hammer can stun enemies on a range, which makes it really good in solo and small scale PvP. Next up we have the Grove Keeper, also known as the Poglog in the Albion community. The E-spell makes you leap forward, making you immune to all types of crowd control and increasing your damage resistance massively. And when you land the impact area, all of your enemies will be stunned for a long time. Very good for ZVZs and small scale PvP. Next up we have the Forge Hammers. The Forge Hammers massively increase your health and give you an additional E-spell that does massive damage in a small radius. You can repeatedly use this spell while you're in the giant form. It's very strong in small scale and solo PvP. The Mace weapon line is a tank type weapon with a lot of crowd control and support spells. Now the starting weapon we have is the Heavy Mace. The Heavy Mace is used in group fights such as small groups and large groups. The E-spell silences and purges everyone in a small AoE radius around the caster. Next up we have the One-Handed Mace. This is also used for small scale and medium scale PvP fights. The E-spell jumps and roots everyone hit by it. No, it's not a root, it's a stun. And also you get iframes when you're in the jump animation. Next up we have the Camlin Mace. This is mainly used for large scale PvP. The E-spell throws out a projectile which will pull every other enemy except for the one hit by it towards the center, which allows your teammates to clap them all at once using all of their DPS at once. Very good for doing big claps in ZVZ fights. Next up we have the Morning Star, which is a very good ganking weapon. It used to be so bad, but right now it's not as bad. It roots people in a AoE around the caster and also has a small dash before the root, so very good for catching up to people and rooting them. Also good for small scale PvP. Next up we have the Incubus Mace. This is a staple for all kinds of PvE content and sometimes even used in PvP. So the spell is very simple. You do a small AoE in front of you and everyone hit by it shrinks, reducing their maximum health, which means they will take a lot more damage from all of your ally spells. Very strong for most content. Good for PvP and PvE. Next up we have the Bedrock Mace, which is very good for crowd control and mostly used in meme builds that are used to knock enemies into group or static mobs to get them killed really fast. So it does this huge wall and everything that is touching the wall will be knocked back a massive distance. Next up we have the Oath Keepers. The Oath Keepers conjure a holy area in front of the caster, which will buff them with a shield, movement speed and lifesteal on hits. Hitting an enemy while in Oath Keepers gives you some healing, so this weapon is used in small scale and large scale PvP for its massive utility. The quarterstaffs are high mobility brawlers with a lot of CC, basically a pain to fight against. So the first quarterstaff you have is the double-bladed staff. The double-bladed staff makes you jump forward, dealing moderate damage and slowing your targets while you land. This weapon is used in solo PvP and sometimes 2v2s. Next up we have the Adept's quarterstaff. I should probably not say adepts on everything. So we have the quarterstaff. The quarterstaffs make you jump to your targeted position, dealing moderate damage and also stunning your opponents. Very good in solo PvP and small scale PvP. Next up we have the ironclad staff. This is used to make your character spin around like a blade, knocking around any enemy that touches you. This is used in ratting people in the static areas where you push your enemies into the raid level mobs that will kill them very quickly, and after that you can just move in and execute them for the loot. Next up we have the soul scythe. The soul scythe is used in a small scale PvP to one-shot combos your enemy. So the E-spell throws out this massive tornado which will slow your enemy and throw them in the air, which allows your teammate to burst them down, or you can use a demon cape to stun them into that soul scythe, dealing massive damage and one-shotting them. Next up we have the phantom twin blades. The phantom twin blades are used to deal massive damage and do crowd control on a small AoE. This is very good for small scale PvP such as arenas and other 5v5 matchups. Next up we have the staff of balance, which debuffs your enemies by slowing them by 50%, reducing their healing received, and it also reduces your healing received to 100%, so you won't get any healing while you're in this storm. It used to be good in small scale PvP, but nowadays no one really uses it. Next up we have the Black Monk staff. This staff is very good in raid level PvE as a support character, and also used for the same reason in a small scale PvP. So the E-spell throws out this blade that spins around, reducing the enemy's damage by a lot. So you will take less damage if you have one of these in your party. Next up we have the Grail Seeker. The Grail Seeker is used for ganking in the red and black zones. So the E-spell puts out these massive lines in front of the target, and they deal moderate damage on impact, but they will also root everyone who stands on them. Used in small scale fights and ganking. The spears are the jack of all trades of Albion and their masters of none, boasting one of the most versatile weapon lines in the entire game. Spears are very good for PvP, but generally not that great in PvE. So the first spear we have is the Adept's one-handed spear. Now the spear's E-spell is very simple, it's just a dash, and it also interrupts any casting that people are doing while you're dashing. Very good for solo PvP. Next up we have the Heron Spear. Unlike the one-handed spear, this one is good for group PvP. The E-spell throws out a projectile which stuns enemies in a AoE and deals some minor damage. Now this allows you to follow up with another damage spell or your allies to combo on them. Very strong in small scale PvP fights. Next up we have the Glaive. This is also one of the funniest weapons in the game. So if you use the E-spell on a target, it will get pulled back if it actually survives the hit. So it's very good for ganking people in a party. When you have a 5v5 fight and you use this weapon, you can kidnap their healer from their back line to all the way to your front line, so they can be killed really fast. Really good for small scale PvP. Next up we have the Trinity Spear. The E-spell makes you jump towards your targeted location, dealing some damage and massively augmenting your auto attacks, increasing damage and attack speed. Also it increases your move speed while you're in that green circle. Very good for solo PvP. Absolutely massive burst damage potential inside of corrupted dungeons and content like that. Next up we have the Pike. The Pike's E-spell is probably one of the simplest. So all you have to do is stack up on the spear charges and hit the enemy. Does massive damage when you hit and also roots them in place for a few seconds. This is very good for solo PvP. Next up we have the Spirit Hunter. This is one of my favorite spears in the game. So this is very good for every content basically. You can use it on any content. It throws out a massive AoE in a straight line that debuffs your enemy's armors and deals moderate damage. You can use it in PvE, PvP, group PvP, Zergs, everything goes. It's really strong. Next up we have the Daybreaker. This is a more complicated version of the normal spear. So the E spell dashes your target forward and does damage to all the enemies you pass through, but it also purges any buffs these enemies happen to have on them while you dash through. Very good for PvP such as solo PvP and duo PvP like the Mists. The swords are a melee DPS brawling class with a lot of utility on the E spells. Now the broadsword is very simple with a leap that deals massive damage to a single target. Very good for single PvP. Next up we have the Claymore. The Claymore is also very strong in solo PvP. It does massive damage to a single target and also stuns them. While you're doing the charge animation, you are immune to all types of damage. Very good for small scale and solo PvP. Next up we have the dual swords. The dual swords are very strong in mists and corrupted dungeons, very good for solo PvP and very small scale PvP. The E spell makes you leap to your targeted position, augmenting your auto attacks, increasing damage, attack speed, and what else? Also does bleed if you have the passive on. Next up we have the Guillotine Pairs. These are used in a large scale PvP fights to destroy a bunch of people at once when they are crowd controlled by other party members. Next up we have the Carving Sword. This is good in almost every content in the game, used for solo PvP, small scale PvP, large scale PvP, and some PvE content too. So the E spell dashes you forward, armor shredding every enemy you pass through based on how many heroic charges you have from the Q stacks. Next up we have the Kingmaker. The Kingmaker does massive damage in front of and behind the player character, but does no damage on the sides, but it also interrupts everyone in a AoE around the character. Very strong in small scale PvP. Next up we have the Clarent Blade. The Clarent Blade throws out a projectile that does 3 things based on how much hero stacks you have. The first heroic charge, you will do a slow on the target. The second heroic charge, you will silence them, and the third heroic charge just does some extra bonus damage. This is very good for solo PvP. Next up we have the Infinity Blade. The Infinity Blade's skill is called the Limit Breaker, which can be channeled for up to 2 seconds with increased move speed. After that you use the attack again and it swipes 2 times in front of you. The first swipe massively slows your enemies down by 70% and the second one deals massive damage. Very good for large scale and small scale PvP. The arcane staffs are ranged support class weapons with a lot of utility and crowd control. The first arcane staff we have is the simple arcane staff, and this staff's special ability throws out a orb which silences and purges any enemy it hits. It is used in a solo and small scale PvP. The Great Arcane Staff is a very good staple in a high level PvE and PvP content such as Avalon raids and ZVZ fights. The special ability allows you to freeze time in a circle, making your allies invulnerable to damage and stunning mobs for a long time. The Witchwork Staff special ability pulls every enemy in the AoE to a single spot, making it a great choice for large scale PvP fights and small scale PvP fights. This is also used for yellow zone content where you bomb a chest with the help of this staff. The Occult Staff creates a corridor in which your enemies are slowed and your allies are fast. So this is a great option for chasing and retreating at the same time, making it a good choice in small scale and large scale PvP fights. The Enigmatic Beam channels a beam that shields every nearby ally with a small shield that can tank damage for them. This is used in raid level PvE content and sometimes in small scale PvP content. The Malevolent Locust has a spell called the Void, which is useful in large scale ZvZ fights because the AoE cleanses all debuffs on your allies. The Evensong special ability is focused on debuffing your enemies. Everyone inside this aura will have their healing received reduced by 25%, and also they will have their damage dealt reduced by 25%. This weapon is used in small scale and large scale PvP fights. Finally, on the arcane staffs we have the astral staff. The spell is very simple. It does massive damage in the AoE while you're channeling the spell. Very strong in small scale and large scale PvP fights. The bows are ranged damage builds with a massive damage down range. Now, the first bow we have is the normal bow, which has an E-spell that buffs your auto attacks to deal massive damage. Now you can follow up the E-spell to get more enchanted arrows to do even more damage. Very strong in solo PvP like corrupted dungeons. Might be good in mists too. Next up we have the war bow. Just like the regular bow, it also has some nice kiting potential. So the war bow's E-spell shoots a really strong arrow, and it has a really short cooldown. As you can see here, it only has 10-second cooldown, so you can massively spam this while kiting your opponent with the frost step spell. Next up we have the whispering bow. The whispering bow gives you a buff which massively increases your auto attack damage, auto attack speed and auto attack range. But in exchange for all of those buffs, it also reduces your armor, making you take a lot more damage. So if you use this weapon, you should use it while your enemy is distracted by another enemy. So this is good for group PvE such as small scale PvE. You can burst down a single target really fast if you use this weapon. Next up we have the longbow. Very strong for doing massive burst damage in a AoE. Very good in small scale and large scale PvP fights. Also good in PvE because of its huge AoE damage. Next up we have the Mist Piercer. The Mist Piercer is very strong in ZvZs and large scale PvP. It shoots out 4 really strong arrows that do massive damage on impact. Really strong for clapping your enemies. Also very high range. It can off screen people, like you can hit someone who's not even on your screen with the amount of range you have with this weapon. Next up we have the Wailing Bow. It looks really cool and also has a really interesting spell. So based on how many enemies you hit, the damage increases, and the first enemy takes the lowest enemy takes the lowest damage and the last enemy takes the highest. So let's just pay attention to the damage numbers here. 262, 327 and 392. So more enemies you hit, more damage the arrow does, and it stacks up to 4 times. Very strong. I don't think it's strong anywhere, but it's used in small scale and large scale PvP. Next up we have the Badon Bow, one of the strongest bows in the entire game, staple in PvE and PvP. It shoots a thundercloud that interrupts your enemy spell casting every 0.2 seconds or something. It's insane. It also does a lot of damage. As you can see, it does 1500 damage. So very strong DPS option, very good utility in PvE content, really good for raid level PvE and small scale PvP fights and solo PvP fights. The holystaffs are one of 2 weapon lines which specialize in healing your allies. The simple holystaff does 2 things based on your allies' health. So if their health is above 40%, they will receive some healing. If they are below 40%, they receive a lot more healing. This is used in small scale PvP fights because of its high healing output on a small cooldown. The Divine Staff places a bubble on your allies which will shield them for a small amount of damage. If the bubble is not broken before it explodes, it will splash and heal everyone in a 5-meter radius up to 5 allies. This is very good in small scale PvP. The Fallen Staff places a massive AoE heal which takes a few seconds to channel, but it is worth it because of its massive healing. This also cleanses all debuffs and crowd control effects on your allies. This is used in small scale PvP and also very good for raid level PvE. The Great Holy Staff generates a holy pulse around your character which pushes out your enemies constantly, making it a really good fit for small scale PvP matches where you want to shield your allies from getting focused down. Used in small scale and solo PvP. Not solo basically, but 2v2s. The Staff of Redemption throws a holy orb on your allies which will bounce in between the targets, healing them with every touch. This is used in a small scale PvP. The Life Touch Staff uses a channel to heal a single target for a lot of health, making it a perfect fit for small scale PvP and 2v2 fights. This also cleanses all kinds of debuffs on your allies except for the damage over time debuffs. The Hollow Fall allows you to jump towards a targeted position, healing all allies in its AoE. This also interrupts enemy spellcasting, so it is very good for small scale PvP. This provides a lot of mobility and utility in its E-spell. Alongside Holy Staffs, Nature Staffs are the other option to heal your allies. The first Nature Staff we have is the Simple Nature Staff. This staff is good for solo PvP and small scale PvP, can also be used in PvE. Very strong healing on a big AoE. The Great Nature Staff is used in soloing group level PvE mobs such as the group dungeon mobs and static mobs. It places a living armor around you. Every time you get hit, you'll heal yourself. This is also useful in a group PvP when a single target is being focused by multiple enemies. All of their attacks can be turned into healing. This is used in a PvE and small scale PvP. The Blight Staff allows your character to levitate, increasing your movement speed and healing every ally that steps into the green field. This is good for anything related to do with PvP, such as solo PvP, small scale PvP, large scale PvP. Anything PvP, this staff will be good at. The Wild Staff has a really good spell that places a large AoE heal in range. This is also very good in small scale and large scale PvP battles due to its versatility. The Rampant Staff is tailored to heal multiple people at once because the spell's scaling increases based on how many allies are standing on top of the trail. So this weapon is solid in Zerg vs Zerg content. Next up we have the Ironroot Staff, which is one of the most complicated weapons in the entire game. If you link two allies together with the Ironroot Staff, the healing received will be reflected between both of them. As you can see, I'm healing this guy, but this guy is also getting healed. This is the healing reflected with the Ironroot's E-spell. That is what happens when you link two allies, but when you link two enemies, the damage will be reflected and shared between them. It's very interesting and very versatile. Based on situation, you can use it in a lot of things, but mainly this is used in small scale PvP and raid level PvE. The final nature staff we have is the Druidic Staff. This staff can place healing spells on two targets at once. It's very simple, it gives them a massive heal after a countdown. Very strong for solo PvE and solo PvP, which is also good for small scale PvP. And with that, we are done with every weapon overview. This video was a lot of fun to film because I learned a lot of new things about a lot of weapons in this game while doing some research for it. And a big thank you to Big Lips Meggy because he made a similar video to this 1 year ago. I would not have made this video if the video he made was any recent, because in this game meta and balances change all the time, and there have been a new weapons since his video. So I hope you guys enjoyed the video. Let's move on to a premium code giveaway and see who wins that. If anyone wants to enter these premium code giveaways, all you have to do is leave a comment on one of my videos and I'll pick a random comment to give the code. It would be nice if you subscribe. And yeah, let's see who wins the code. Feel like Black Zone is better, I go with 5.1. Well, yeah, Black Zone obviously has more loot than Yellow Zone, but Yellow Zone is just more consistent because you don't die. It's basically a preference thing. You can do whatever you want. Well, that's it for the video, guys. Consider becoming a member if you want to support the channel. Subscribe if you haven't already, and I will see you guys in the next one. Bye.